Dust choked the rusted air of the fighting pits. 6,000 alien throats roared with laughter, a jagged wall of sound crashing down on the fragile, pale creature trembling in the center sand. They expected a slaughter. They expected the towering, multi-limbed behemoth to snap the Terran's spine in seconds. Instead, the beast lowered its armored snout, sniffing the stale sweat and fear. The laughter abruptly died as a deep, rumbling growl vibrated through the arena floor. Little brother, the holding cell smelled of ammonia, burnt ozone, and old terror. Arthur sat with his back pressed against the corrugated steel wall, feeling the rhythmic, mechanical thumping of the station's atmospheric cyclers vibrating through his spine. He drew his knees up to his chest, his hands, perpetually stained with engine grease and carbon scoring, were shaking. He didn't try to stop them. There was no point in performing bravery for the empty dark. He was a mechanic. He understood the universe in terms of stress limits, torque, and material fatigue. His own materials were currently failing. He swallowed hard. His throat felt like it was coated in fiberglass. He hadn't had a sip of clean water in 2 days, not since Fletcher's enforcers dragged him out of the maintenance bays of Sector 4. Fletcher, a bloated, wealthy syndicate boss who demanded his protection, cut in pure iridium, completely indifferent to the fact that Arthur's freighter had blown a primary gasket and left him stranded, broke, and eating synthesized protein paste that tasted like wet cardboard. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, heavy, booted, uneven. Arthur closed his eyes. He focused on the damp chill of the metal against his thin, sweat-soaked jumpsuit. He didn't pray. The universe didn't listen to prayers. It listened to gravity and leverage, and right now, Arthur had neither. The heavy lock on his cell door clanked, the sound sharp and entirely devoid of mercy. The hydraulic hinges groaned. Harsh, artificial halogen light spilled into the cramped room, blinding him. "Up, ape!" a voice barked. It was Dallas. The enforcer was humanoid enough, 2 arms, 2 legs, but that was where the similarities ended. Dallas stood 7 feet tall, with a face that looked like crushed granite and skin the color of bruised plums. He carried a stun baton that hummed with a low, sick frequency. Arthur didn't argue. He pushed himself off the floor, his knees popping in the quiet cell. His boots scuffed against the grates. His mouth tasted sour, a mixture of bile and the copper tang of fear. "Move!" Dallas grunted, shoving Arthur from behind. Arthur stumbled into the corridor. The air here was warmer, thick with the stench of ozone, and the unmistakable sickly sweet odor of hundreds of different alien biologies packed into the stands above. The noise was a dull roar, a constant physical pressure against his eardrums. It sounded like an ocean crashing against a seawall, if the ocean was made of teeth and malice. They walked down the sloping tunnel. The light at the end was a blinding rectangle of yellow sand and glaring stadium lamps. Arthur's chest tightened. Panic, raw and unrefined, clawed at his ribs. He was 5'9". He weighed 160 pounds soaking wet. He was holding a rusted, heavy wrench he'd managed to sneak out of the maintenance bay. A pathetic, laughable weapon against whatever Fletcher had waiting for him. "You're a joke, Terran," Dallas sneered, leaning down so Arthur could smell his breath, which reeked of fermented kelp. "Fletcher wants you to run. He put money on how many seconds it takes for the apex to catch you. Do us all a favor and try to make it past 20. Arthur didn't reply. He gripped the wrench tighter, the rough, pitted metal digging into his palm. Dallas shoved him one last time. Arthur stumbled out of the shadow of the tunnel and into the blinding light of the arena. The heat hit him instantly. It baked up from the coarse yellow sand, radiating into his boots. But it was the noise that nearly dropped him to his knees. The stands were a towering circular amphitheater of rusted metal and flashing neon, packed tight with thousands of spectators. As Arthur staggered into the center of the pit, a collective deafening noise erupted from the crowd. Laughter. It wasn't human laughter. It was a cacophony of clicks, deep chest rumbles, high-pitched shrieks, and synthetic bursts from translator collars. It was mockery made physical. They were looking at this pale, soft, hairless biped in a dirty gray jumpsuit, holding a piece of scrap metal. Arthur turned slowly in a circle. He felt naked. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, to find a dark corner and curl into a ball. His vision swam. The glare of the floodlights made the edges of the arena blur. High above, behind a pane of reinforced plexiglass, he saw Fletcher. The syndicate boss was lounging in a padded chair, a wide, grotesque grin stretching across his wide, flat face. Fletcher raised a glass of something glowing blue, offering Arthur a mock toast. The laughter rolled down the tiered seating, suffocating and heavy. It dug into Arthur's skin. It made him feel infinitesimally small. 20 seconds, Arthur thought, his breathing growing shallow and fast. Just survive for 20 seconds. Then, on the far side of the arena, a massive set of blast doors began to grind upward. The grinding of the gears was louder than the crowd. The heavy metal doors shuddered as they rose, revealing a tunnel of absolute blackness. The laughter in the stands died down, replaced by a tense, electric anticipation. The air in the arena seemed to change. It grew heavier. A terrible primal musk wafted out of the dark tunnel. The smell of turned earth, raw meat, and pure, concentrated apex lethality. It was a scent that bypassed Arthur's rational mind and spoke directly to the lizard brain at the base of his skull. Predator. Arthur took a step back. His boot slipped slightly in the loose sand. He tightened his grip on the wrench, but his hands were slick with sweat. Something moved in the shadows. It didn't step out. It flowed. The creature that emerged into the halogen light was a nightmare constructed of muscle, armor, and lethal intent. It was the size of a heavy cargo hauler. It walked on 4 massive, tree trunk-like limbs, but its torso suggested a capacity to rear up. Its hide was a chaotic mixture of thick, matted black fur and heavy, interlocking plates of bone-white armor that covered its shoulders, spine, and skull. Its head was broad and blunt, entirely lacking eyes. Instead, deep sensory pits lined its snout, and its ears were long, tattered, and constantly twitching, tracking the microscopic shifts in the air. When it opened its maw, it didn't roar. It exhaled, a low, vibrating hiss that rattled Arthur's teeth in his skull. Rows of serrated, translucent teeth dripped with thick, clear saliva that sizzled faintly as it hit the hot sand. The crowd erupted into a frenzy of cheers. They stomped their feet, the metal bleachers shaking violently. Arthur couldn't move. The panic had peaked, leaving behind a cold, numbing detachment. He dropped the wrench. It hit the sand with a pathetic, muffled thud. He didn't even notice. He was looking at death. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't a noble sacrifice. It was going to be a messy, agonizing tearing of meat and breaking of bone to entertain a bored crowd of criminals and mercenaries. He felt a sudden, sharp pain in his stomach. Bile rose in his throat, He leaned over, clutching his abdomen, and dry heaved. A humiliating raw sound escaped his lips. He wiped his mouth with the back of his trembling, grease-stained sleeve. He was supposed to be angry. He was supposed to shout defiance. But all he felt was an overwhelming, crushing sadness. He was going to die light years away from the rain, from the smell of pine trees, from a decent cup of coffee. The beast turned its massive armored skull toward him. The sensory pits flared. It had locked onto his movement, onto his smell. Arthur stood up straight, his chest heaving. He closed his eyes. He didn't want to see it coming. He just wanted it to be quick. The ground shuddered. Thump! The beast took a step. Thump! Another step. The crowd was screaming now, a bloodthirsty crescendo. They were counting down the seconds. Dallas had been wrong. It wasn't going to take 20 seconds. The beast was closing the distance of 100 yards in terrifying, ground-eating strides. Arthur braced himself. He tensed his neck muscles, waiting for the impact, waiting for the crushing weight of the jaws. He could feel the rush of displaced air. He could smell the overpowering stench of copper and hot breath right in front of his face. The heat radiating off the creature felt like an open furnace. The sand rained down over Arthur's boots, kicked up by the beast's sudden deceleration. The impact never came. The arena fell dead silent. It was a sudden, absolute vacuum of noise, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Arthur kept his eyes squeezed shut for 2 long, agonizing seconds. The heat was still there. The smell was still there. Slowly, his fingers twitching, he opened his eyes. The creature was inches away. Its massive, armored head was lowered, hovering just in front of Arthur's face. The sheer scale of it was terrifying up close. Each of its teeth was the size of Arthur's forearm. The bone plates on its skull were deeply scarred and pitted, telling a history of endless, brutal violence. Arthur's breath hitched. He was frozen, entirely locked in place by a biological terror so profound it paralyzed his vocal cords. The beast didn't strike. It leaned closer. Arthur felt a wet, hot gust of air hit his face as the creature inhaled deeply. The sensory pits along its snout flared wide, pulsing with a faint, bioluminescent red light. It was smelling him. It was dissecting the chemical makeup of his sweat, his fear, his very blood. Arthur stood perfectly still, a single bead of sweat rolling down his temple, cutting a clean track through the dirt and engine grease on his cheek. The beast snorted, a sound like a high-pressure air valve releasing. It pulled its head back slightly. It tilted its massive skull, the blind, heavily armored face studying him with an intelligence that made Arthur's blood run cold. Then a sensation invaded Arthur's mind. It wasn't a sound. It was a physical pressure at the base of his skull, a heavy, static-laced weight that pushed through the cheap, outdated neural translator implant embedded behind his right ear. The implant sparked, a sharp jab of pain shooting down Arthur's neck before the static cleared. A voice resonated inside Arthur's chest. It was deep, resonant, and weary, the auditory equivalent of grinding tectonic plates. "You smell of the deep gravity." Arthur blinked, his mouth falling open slightly. His heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He couldn't speak. He wasn't even sure if he was hallucinating from the stress. The beast shifted its weight, the sand crunching loudly under its massive paws. It lowered its head further until its snout was level with Arthur's chest. "You smell of crushed rock," of high atmospheric pressure, of predatory cycles and desperate survival. The voice in Arthur's head rumbled, shifting from curiosity to a strange, heavy reverence. You are not soft, like the weeping things in the stands. You are forged in the heavy dirt. You are a child of a death world. Arthur's mind raced. He remembered the briefings from his xenobiology courses back in the Sol system. Earth was an anomaly, a Class 12 death world. Most of the galactic community evolved on gentle, low-gravity garden worlds, where the climate was controlled and apex predators had been bred out of existence millions of years ago. The aliens in the stands, Fletcher, Dallas, all of them, they were fragile. They relied on technology and sheer numbers to conquer, but this beast, it wasn't a lab experiment. It wasn't an alien pet. It was a survivor, just like him. Arthur found his voice. It was raspy, barely a whisper, but he didn't need to shout. He just needed the implant to pick up the sub-vocalization. "Earth," Arthur breathed, his voice cracking. "I'm from Earth." The beast let out a long, low vibration that shook the loose sand around Arthur's boots. It wasn't a growl, it was a purr, a massive, bone-rattling purr of recognition. "Earth," the beast repeated, the word rolling heavily through Arthur's mind. "The myth, the crucible. My kind comes from the jagged peaks of Voltaris, a world of ice and teeth. We thought we were the last of the heavy-born, the last of the true hunters." The creature suddenly stepped forward, closing the final inch of distance. Arthur flinched, but the beast only pressed its broad, armored forehead gently against Arthur's chest. The sheer weight of the gesture nearly knocked him backward, but he braced his legs, holding his ground. The gesture was unmistakable. It was submission. It was respect. "Little brother," the beast rumbled, the psychic weight of the words thick with a strange, fierce affection. Up in the stands, the silence broke. It didn't break with cheers, but with a murmuring, rising tide of confusion. The thousands of spectators leaned forward, their multifaceted eyes and sensory organs twitching. They couldn't hear the telepathic exchange. All they saw was their undefeated, monstrous killing machine gently nuzzling the frail, trembling human. High up in his private box, Fletcher stood. His bloated face was purple with rage. He slammed his fist against the reinforced plasglass. Even from this distance, Arthur could see the crime boss screaming into a comms unit, ordering the handlers to shock the beast, to force it to attack. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the arena. The beast jerked. A blue arc of electricity danced across the neural compliance collar bolted around its thick neck. The creature let out a pained, furious hiss, its muscles bunching tightly. Arthur felt the anger before he consciously processed it. It wasn't just his anger, it was a shared, searing wave of hatred pouring from the beast into his own mind. "They're hurting you," Arthur whispered, his hands curling into fists. The fear was evaporating, burned away by the sudden, intense connection to the massive predator in front of him. The beast shook its heavy head, ignoring the residual sparks from the collar. It turned its blind, armored face up toward Fletcher's box. "They think they own the gravity," the beast communicated, the voice now sharp, vibrating with lethal intent. "They think chains can hold the apex." Arthur looked down at the rusted wrench half buried in the sand. He didn't bend down to pick it up. He didn't need it anymore. He looked back up at the beast. The creature was waiting. It was deferring to him, two Deathworlders, stranded in a galaxy of glass and paper, surrounded by things that thought they were gods. "Can you reach the glass?" Arthur asked quietly, staring up at Fletcher's box. The beast let out a low, terrifying rumble that echoed off the arena walls, loud enough to physically shake the spectators in the first few rows. "I can reach the sky, little brother, if you ask it." Arthur wiped the sweat and grease from his face. His hands had stopped shaking. The cynical, exhausted mechanic was gone, replaced by an ancient, quiet instinct that had slept in his DNA for hundreds of thousands of years. "Take the box," Arthur said, his voice cold and steady. The beast reared up, its colossal frame blocking out the stadium lights, and for the first time that day, it unleashed a true, earth-shattering roar. The roar possessed a physical weight. It didn't just rattle the rusted corrugated walls of the arena, it compressed the air in Arthur's lungs. It was a sound born from high-gravity storms and tectonic grinding, a pure expression of kinetic violence that the artificial atmosphere of the station struggled to contain. Arthur stumbled backward, his hands instinctively flying to cover his ears. The sand beneath his boots vibrated so violently it blurred. The beast didn't hesitate. Its hind legs, thick as bridge supports and corded with muscle density that defied standard biology, bunched beneath its armored frame. The coarse yellow sand exploded outward in a localized shockwave as the creature launched itself upward. It was a terrifying defiance of gravity. A creature of that mass shouldn't have been able to fly, yet it hurled itself toward the reinforced plasglass of Fletcher's VIP box 40 feet above the pit. The crowd's laughter had already died, but now their silence shattered into a chaotic chorus of high-pitched shrieks and chittering panic. They weren't cheering for blood anymore. They were suddenly acutely aware of how thin the stadium barriers actually were. The beast struck the arena wall just below the box. Its massive foreclaws dug into the pitted Durasteel plating like hot knives through cheap plastic. Metal shrieked. The sound was deafening, a high, agonizing tear of structural failure. The creature hung there for a fraction of a second, its muscles trembling under the immense strain, its blind armored skull angled upward. In the VIP box, Fletcher was no longer laughing. Arthur watched the syndicate boss scramble backward, his blue drink spilling across the plush carpet, staining it dark. Fletcher's flat face was a mask of utter, uncomprehending terror. He was slapping the emergency bulkhead controls on the wall, but the mechanisms were too slow. Another blue arc of electricity snapped across the beast's neck. The handler's automated systems were trying to fry its nervous system. The creature convulsed, a wet hiss escaping its jaws, but the pain only seemed to feed the engine of its rage. With a final, explosive contraction of its shoulders, the beast drove its skull directly into the reinforced plasglass. The impact sounded like a detonating artillery shell. The transparent aluminum composite was designed to withstand a direct hit from a light railgun. It spiderwebbed instantly under the sheer, concentrated mass of the apex predator's bone-plated skull. The beast pulled back and slammed its head forward again. Crack! A jagged fissure split the pane. The pressure seal of the climate-controlled box broke with a violent hiss, sucking loose debris and condensation out into the stale air of the arena. Arthur watched, paralyzed, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He felt a sickening cocktail of awe and absolute terror. He was completely out of his depth. He was a guy who fixed busted hyperdrives and calibrating sublight thrusters. He wasn't supposed to be an accessory to a massacre. Yet, as the telepathic link bled a raw, unfiltered rush of the beast's vindication into his own mind, a dark, suppressed corner of Arthur's soul felt a grim satisfaction. The beast reared back a third time, its front claws anchored deep into the metal wall, and drove both its front limbs through the failing glass. The barrier exploded outward. A shower of glittering razor-sharp shards rained down onto the arena floor, sparkling innocuously in the harsh halogen light before hitting the sand like shrapnel. Arthur threw his arms over his head, turning his back as the heavier pieces impacted around him, kicking up plumes of dust. Above, the beast pulled itself into the shattered box. Arthur didn't see what happened next. He didn't want to. The sounds were enough. There were shouts, the chaotic popping of a lightweight kinetic sidearm, and then a wet, heavy crunch that instantly silenced the gunfire. A warm, metallic mist drifted out of the broken window, carrying the unmistakable, coppery stench of violently spilled blood. The telepathic presence in Arthur's mind shifted. The blinding white heat of the beast's rage cooled into a heavy, dark satisfaction. "The sky is broken, little brother," the deep voice rumbled in the base of Arthur's skull, the mental transmission laced with the phantom taste of iron. Arthur lowered his arms. His jumpsuit was covered in yellow dust and sweat. He looked up at the shattered box. The beast was turning around, its massive silhouette framed against the flickering emergency lights inside the VIP suite. Blood, dark and viscous, dripped from its serrated jaws, sizzling faintly as it hit the heated metal rim of the broken window. The entire arena was in a state of absolute pandemonium. The spectators were trampling each other, desperate to reach the upper exit tunnels. The air was thick with the stench of released fear, pheromones, voided bowels, and panic. The illusion of their safety had been shattered just as violently as the plasglass. They were no longer spectators safely removed from the violence. They were potential prey. Arthur knew he had to move. The local station security, or whatever heavily armed mercenaries Fletcher employed, would be swarming the arena within minutes. But his legs felt like lead. His knees were trembling so violently he could barely stand. Thump! The beast leapt back out of the box, plummeting 40 feet to the arena floor. It landed with a bone-jarring impact that sent another shockwave through the sand. It didn't stagger. It simply absorbed the kinetic energy through its massive joints and turned its blind, sensory-pitted face toward Arthur. Arthur took a tentative step backward. The reality of the creature was overwhelming. It smelled of ozone, old blood, and raw, turned earth. "We need to get out of here," Arthur said, his voice cracking, barely audible over the roaring panic of the fleeing crowd. He pointed a shaking finger toward the dark tunnel the beast had emerged from. "That way, the handler pens. It leads to the underbelly." The beast let out a low, acknowledging rumble, but as it took a step toward Arthur, the heavy metal collar around its neck flashed with a violent, blinding blue light. The creature collapsed. The beast hit the sand hard, a strangled hiss escaping its jaws. Its massive limbs convulsed uncontrollably, the heavy bone plates on its shoulders scraping against the grit. Arthur froze. The automated security protocols. With Fletcher dead, the handler systems were likely defaulting to maximum containment. The collar was flooding the beast's central nervous system with lethal voltage. Pain, The word wasn't spoken. It was driven like a spike into Arthur's temporal lobe. The telepathic link was a two-way street, and the beast's agony flooded Arthur's mind. It felt like white-hot needles pressing into the back of his eyes. He squeezed his eyes shut, his hands gripping his head, groaning through clenched teeth. He could run. The gate was open. The crowd was entirely focused on saving themselves. He could slip into the handler tunnels, navigate the ventilation shafts, and disappear into the station's lower levels. He was a survivor. Survivors didn't carry dead weight. They didn't tie themselves to multi-ton alien apex predators. Arthur opened his eyes. The creature was scraping its massive claws weakly against the sand, its breathing shallow and erratic. Damn it, Arthur thought. Damn this entire station. He dropped to his knees and scrambled forward, grabbing the rusted wrench he had dropped earlier. The metal felt heavy and familiar in his grip. It wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a tool. He understood tools. He crawled toward the massive, convulsing head of the predator. Up close, the heat radiating off the beast was oppressive. The thick, matted black fur was coarse, like industrial wire brush bristles. Arthur reached out with a trembling hand and pressed it against the creature's armored neck, right beside the pulsing, sparking collar. "Hold still," Arthur muttered, though he knew the beast couldn't control its spasms. "Just hold still, big guy." The collar was a thick band of crude durasteel, locked with a heavy magnetic clasp. Arthur leaned in close, ignoring the smell of singed fur and ozone that burned his nostrils. He squinted at the locking mechanism. It was a standard-issue industrial mag lock, the kind they used on heavy cargo containers. Cheap, brutal, highly susceptible to physical trauma if hit in the right spot. Another shock cycled through the collar. Arthur's hand was resting on the beast's armor when the voltage hit. A secondary arc of electricity jumped from the metal band, snapping against Arthur's forearm. "Ah, shit!" Arthur recoiled, dropping the wrench. His arm went completely numb, the muscles locking up in a painful cramp. He fell back onto his rear in the sand, clutching his right arm against his chest, gasping for air. "Leave!" the voice rumbled weakly in his mind. The psychic projection was fading, drowned out by the static of the electrical shocks. "The gravity is too heavy here. Go!" Arthur looked at his numb, trembling hand. He looked at the massive creature dying in the dirt to entertain a bunch of soft-skinned bureaucrats and thugs. He thought of the deep gravity of Earth. He thought of the crushing pressure of the maintenance shafts, the endless grinding work of keeping failing machines alive. "I don't leave things broken," Arthur grunted, forcing himself back onto his knees. He snatched up the wrench with his left hand, switching it clumsily to his tingling right. He crawled back to the beast's neck. He didn't have a laser cutter. He didn't have a decryption pad. All he had was leverage and the precise knowledge of where machines failed. "There's a shear pin," Arthur muttered to himself, his eyes scanning the underside of the heavy magnetic clasp. "There's always a shear pin for manual override." He found it. A small, recessed dimple in the steel housing, crusted with dirt and dried blood. Arthur wedged the thick, flattened end of the rusted wrench into the gap between the locking casing and the beast's thick hide. He had to push hard, burying his hands into the coarse, hot fur. The beast groaned, its head rolling slightly, its massive, serrated teeth passing inches from Arthur's thigh. "Almost," Arthur breathed, sweat stinging his eyes. He positioned the wrench, He needed kinetic force. He couldn't just pry it. He had to shock the pin out of alignment. He raised his heavy boot and positioned it over the handle of the wrench. He gripped the beast's armored plating with his left hand to steady himself. "Brace yourself," Arthur yelled. He drove the heel of his boot down onto the steel handle of the wrench with every ounce of strength he possessed. The wrench bit hard into the casing. Metal shrieked against metal. Nothing happened. Another charge was building in the collar. The blue indicator lights on the casing shifted to a rapid, angry red pulse. "Come on, you piece of garbage!" Arthur screamed, raising his boot and stomping down again. Crack! The shear pin snapped. The sudden release of tension sent the heavy magnetic lock flying open. The thick Durasteel band sprang apart, falling away from the beast's neck and landing heavily in the sand, where it immediately short-circuited in a shower of white sparks. Arthur collapsed backward, his chest heaving, his right arm throbbing with a dull, sickening ache. The beast stopped convulsing. For 10 long seconds, the only sound in their immediate vicinity was the hissing of the broken collar and Arthur's ragged breathing. Above them, the arena was nearly empty, the last of the spectators shoving their way through the bottlenecked exit doors. Slowly, the massive creature shifted. Its front legs braced against the sand, and it pushed itself up. The movement was sluggish at first, but as the residual electricity bled out of its nervous system, its imposing grace returned. It shook its massive armored head like a dog clearing water from its ears, a spray of hot saliva and loose sand catching the halogen light. It turned its blind sensory pits down to where Arthur lay panting in the dirt. The pressure in Arthur's mind returned, no longer laced with static or pain, but clear, deep, and overwhelmingly solid. "The chain is broken." The beast lowered its massive snout and gently nudged Arthur's shoulder. The touch was incredibly delicate for a creature that had just obliterated a reinforced bunker. "We move now, mechanic. The soft ones will bring fire." Arthur nodded slowly. He didn't question how the beast knew the word mechanic. The telepathic link was pulling concepts directly from his own mind. He forced himself up, his legs feeling like jelly. He picked up his wrench and tucked it into the utility belt of his dirty jumpsuit. "The handler tunnels," Arthur said, pointing to the dark archway across the sand. "They connect to the station's heavy freight elevators. It's the only way we fit." The beast stepped over the sparking remains of its collar and positioned itself beside Arthur. It didn't take the lead. It waited. Arthur looked at the creature, a hysterical, cynical laugh bubbling up in his throat, dying before it reached his lips. He was walking out of a death pit with an alien tank made of teeth and bone. "All right," Arthur muttered, wiping a streak of grease and dirt across his forehead. "Let's go break some more things." The transition from the glaring heat of the arena to the subterranean chill of the handler tunnels was jarring. The air here was damp, thick with the smell of industrial cleaner attempting to mask the copper scent of old blood and decaying meat. The walls were raw, unfinished concrete, lined with thick bundles of exposed wiring and rusted hydraulic pipes that hissed and wept oily condensation. The only illumination came from caged, flickering sodium bulbs that cast long, sickly yellow shadows. Arthur walked slightly ahead, his boots splashing softly in shallow puddles of unidentifiable liquid. Behind him, the beast moved with a terrifying silence. Despite its massive bulk, its padded paws barely made a sound on the concrete. The only indicator of its presence was the oppressive radiating heat at Arthur's back and the low rhythmic exhales that stirred the stagnant air. "They are close," the voice vibrated in Arthur's mind. "I taste the ozone of their weapons in the air currents." Arthur stopped, pressing his back against the damp, cold concrete of the tunnel wall. He held his breath, listening. Ahead, the tunnel curved sharply to the right. From around the bend, he heard the heavy, synchronized thud of tactical boots and the high-pitched, oscillating whine of fully charged plasma rifles. "Security detail," Arthur whispered. "Probably heavily armored. My wrench isn't going to do much against plasma. Let me pass, little brother. I will tear the metal from their flesh." Arthur looked back at the beast. Its sensory pits were flared wide, pulsing with a deep, angry crimson. The muscles beneath its armored plating were coiled tight. It was ready to charge. "No," Arthur said softly, putting a grease-stained hand up. "If you charge down a narrow corridor into a firing squad, they'll burn you to ash before you reach them. You don't have the room to maneuver here." The beast rumbled, a sound of deep frustration. "We die standing then." "We don't die today," Arthur muttered, his eyes scanning the tunnel. He wasn't a soldier. He didn't know tactical formations or breaching protocols. But he knew this station. He knew the cheap, terrible infrastructure that held it together because he was the one who had been forced to patch it. He looked up. A thick, insulated mainline plasma coolant pipe ran along the ceiling, directly above the curve in the tunnel. It was old. The insulation was peeling, and a heavy, rusted pressure valve jutted out dangerously close to a bundle of exposed electrical conduit. "I need a distraction," Arthur breathed, his mind calculating the pressure limits. "And I need you to wait until I say go." "I am the apex," the beast replied, the psychic tone vibrating with a hint of pride. "I do not hide." "You do, if you want to see the sky again," Arthur shot back, his voice tense but completely devoid of fear. The shared link made him bolder. He could feel the creature's lethal potential, but he also felt its trust. Trust the mechanic. The beast exhaled a long, hot breath against Arthur's neck. "I wait." Arthur crept forward, dropping onto his hands and knees to keep his profile low. He edged toward the corner. The glow from the approaching security detail cast long, distorted shadows against the far wall. "Spread out! Watch the thermal sensors!" A rough, familiar voice echoed down the tunnel. Dallas. The massive, plum-skinned enforcer had survived the VIP box collapse and had rounded up a kill squad. "Fletcher's dead, but the station bounty on that beast is enough to buy us all off this rock. The Terran is nothing. Burn him if you see him." Arthur grimaced. He pulled a heavy magnetized lug nut from his utility pocket, a piece of scrap he usually used for balancing rotors. He leaned around the corner just enough to see them. 6 heavily armored guards, moving in a tight wedge formation, their rifles sweeping the darkness. Dallas was in the center, looking nervous despite his size. Arthur didn't aim at the guards. He aimed up. He threw the heavy lug nut with every ounce of force his tired arm could muster, right at the rusted pressure valve of the coolant pipe above their heads. Clang. The impact was sharp and loud in the enclosed space. The guards instantly jerked their weapons upward, tracking the sound. "Movement in the pipes!" one of the guards shouted, firing a blind burst of superheated blue plasma into the ceiling. It was exactly what Arthur wanted. The plasma bolts vaporized the rusted valve and sheared through the already failing pipe casing. with an ear-splitting shriek of escaping pressure. Super-chilled, toxic liquid coolant blasted downward in a thick, blinding white cloud. The guards screamed as the freezing liquid hit their armor, instantly dropping the ambient temperature in the tunnel to sub-zero. Their thermal optics blinded themselves, completely whited out by the sudden, massive thermal shift. Simultaneously, the rapidly expanding coolant cloud hit the exposed electrical conduits along the wall. The wires sparked violently, and with a loud pop, the primary breakers tripped. The tunnel plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. "Hold fire! Hold fire! I can't see!" Dallas roared, his voice thick with panic. Arthur flattened himself against the floor, covering his head. The air was suddenly freezing, the condensation turning to frost on his jumpsuit. "Now," Arthur whispered into the dark. The beast didn't roar. It didn't make a sound. Arthur felt the displacement of air as the massive predator launched itself past him, an engine of silent, perfectly evolved violence. The screams started a second later. They were not the organized, tactical shouts of a security detail. They were the raw, high-pitched shrieks of prey, realizing they were trapped in the dark with a monster. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, though it made no difference in the pitch black. The sounds were horrifying. The heavy, wet crunch of bone snapping under immense pressure, the sickening tear of flesh, the frantic, wild firing of plasma rifles that illuminated the tunnel in brief, strobe-like flashes of blue light. In those split-second flashes, Arthur saw the beast. It was a blur of armored plating and serrated teeth, moving with impossible speed, dismembering the squad with terrifying, systematic efficiency. It didn't fight. It harvested. Dallas was the last to scream, a heavy gurgling sound that ended with a sickening snap. Then silence. Only the hiss of the leaking coolant pipe remained. Arthur lay shivering on the floor. His stomach churned. He gagged, fighting the urge to vomit again. The smell in the tunnel was no longer old blood. It was fresh, hot, and overwhelmingly metallic. The heavy, rhythmic thud of the beast's paws approached him in the dark. Arthur didn't flinch. The telepathic link was entirely calm. The beast felt no malice, no residual rage, just the quiet satisfaction of a completed hunt. A heavy, warm snout pressed against the top of Arthur's head. "The path is clear, little brother." Arthur swallowed the bile in his throat. He slowly pushed himself up to his feet, leaning heavily against the freezing concrete wall. The emergency backup lighting finally kicked in, a dim, pulsing red glow that barely penetrated the lingering fog of the coolant. The tunnel was a charnel house. Arthur purposefully kept his eyes fixed forward, refusing to look at the torn remains of Dallas and the guards. "The freight elevator is at the end of this hall," Arthur said, his voice completely hollow. He felt a profound, exhausting numbness settling into his bones. He started walking, his boots slipping slightly on the slick, blood-coated concrete. The beast followed, keeping pace, its massive shoulder brushing lightly against the wall. They reached the heavy steel doors of the freight lift. Arthur pried open the manual access panel with his wrench and yanked the heavy industrial lever downward. The massive gears ground loudly, and the heavy doors slowly pulled apart, revealing the cavernous, grease-stained interior of the lift car. Arthur stepped inside. The beast followed, its massive bulk taking up nearly half the space. Arthur pulled the lever to engage the ascent. The elevator lurched upward, groaning under the combined weight. They were heading for the upper hangar bays. to the ships. Arthur leaned against the cold metal wall of the elevator and slowly slid down until he was sitting on the grated floor. He rested his elbows on his knees and buried his face in his dirty, shaking hands. He was exhausted. He was broken. He was alive. The beast lay down across from him, its massive armored head resting on its front paws. The sensory pits glowed a soft, steady red in the dim light of the ascending elevator. "You bleed inside, mechanic," the beast observed gently, sensing Arthur's profound internal conflict. "You mourn the meat that tried to kill you." Arthur looked up, his eyes bloodshot and weary. We aren't built to enjoy the killing. On Earth, we learned to build so we wouldn't have to hunt anymore. We made tools. We made rules." The beast let out a low, vibrating hum that warmed the cold air of the elevator. "Rules are paper, little brother. Gravity is real. When the paper burns, only the heavy-born remain." The creature shifted its massive head, pointing its blind snout toward the ceiling of the lift, toward the distant stars waiting beyond the station's hull. "We will find a world of heavy dirt. We will find your Earth, and we will leave the paper men to their burning." Arthur looked at his grease-stained hands. He thought of the rusted wrench tucked in his belt. He was a mechanic. He fixed broken things. "Yeah," Arthur whispered into the hum of the rising elevator, a tiny hard spark of genuine resilience finally catching fire in his chest. "Let's go find some heavy dirt." The freight elevator's ascent was agonizingly slow, an agonizing crawl of grinding gears and overstressed cables. Arthur sat with his back against the vibrating metal wall, his knees drawn up, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. The chill of the subterranean tunnels clung to his sweat-soaked jumpsuit. He felt hollowed out, as if the adrenaline had scoured his veins with steel wool and left nothing behind but dust and a throbbing, relentless ache in his right arm. Across the grated floor, the beast lay completely still. If not for the deep, rhythmic expansion of its massive ribcage and the faint, luminescent pulse of the sensory pits along its snout, it could have been a statue carved from obsidian and bone. "Your heart beats like a trapped bird, mechanic," the heavy voice resonated in Arthur's skull. It wasn't an insult. It was a simple, tactile observation, colored with a strange, rumbling empathy. Arthur let his head thump back against the wall. "That's because we're about to walk into Hangar 4. The station alarms are already blaring. Every corporate security detail, every mercenary, and every trigger-happy dock worker with a pulse is going to be waiting for us. Let them wait. Their metal is soft. Their blood is thin. They have ship-mounted cannons, big guy," Arthur muttered, dragging a greasy hand down his face. "You can't punch a hole in a heavy plasma battery. If we don't find a ship that's already prepped for launch, we're going to die on the docking ramp." The beast shifted, raising its heavy, armored skull. The telepathic connection flared with a quiet, unshakable certainty. "You will find the vessel. You speak to the machines. You know their hidden veins." Arthur laughed. It was a dry, scraping sound. "I fix hypervalves for minimum wage. I don't steal star ships. You survive the deep gravity. You will steal the ship." The elevator jolted violently, the ascending momentum suddenly arresting. A loud metallic clank echoed through the shaft, followed by the hiss of pneumatic seals disengaging. They had reached the upper hangar deck. The heavy steel doors dragged themselves open. The air that rushed into the cabin was a brutal contrast to the damp tunnels. It was freezing, carrying the sharp chemical tang of aviation promethium, ionized engine exhaust, and the sterile, metallic scent of the hard vacuum waiting just beyond the atmospheric shields. Arthur pushed himself to his feet. His legs trembled, but he forced them to lock. He stepped out of the elevator, moving quickly into the shadow of a massive stack of magnetic shipping crates. The beast followed, its colossal frame slipping through the shadows with a fluid, predatory grace that entirely belied its weight. The hangar bay was cavernous, an echoing cathedral of utilitarian commerce. Overhead, a dizzying network of catwalks and fueling gantries crisscrossed the ceiling. Below, dozens of starships rested on heavy hydraulic landing pads. The station's red emergency sirens were spinning, casting frantic, blood-colored shadows across the hulls of the ships. Automated lockdown klaxons blared a rhythmic, deafening warning. Arthur scanned the rows of vessels. His eyes darted past the sleek, aerodynamic luxury yachts of the syndicate bosses and the narrow, heavily armed interceptors used by local security. They were too small. The beast would never fit through their airlocks, let alone into their pressurized cabins. "There," Arthur whispered, pointing his wrench toward the far end of the bay. Sitting heavily on Pad 9 was a Kodiak-class heavy freighter. It was a brutal, ugly piece of engineering, designed entirely for function over form. Its hull was a patchwork of dull gray durasteel and rusted, unpainted replacement panels. It had a massive drop-down rear cargo ramp and twin sublight engine pods that looked large enough to generate a localized gravity well. It was a junker. It was perfect. "It smells of old storms," the beast communicated, its sensory pits flaring as it analyzed the chemical residue baking off the freighter's hull. "It is heavy." "It's a brick with thrusters," Arthur corrected, slipping out from behind the crates and moving in a low crouch toward the ship. "But it can take a hit. Come on." They moved across the open tarmac, darting between service vehicles and fueling lines. They were 50 yards from the Kodiak's lowered cargo ramp when the first security detail rounded the nose of an adjacent ship. There were 4 of them, not station thugs, but corporate security. They wore full matte black environmental armor and carried heavy, shoulder-mounted kinetic repeaters. The lead guard froze, his visor locking onto the massive bone-plated monster stepping out of the shadows. "Target acquired! Pad 9!" The guard screamed into his comms unit, dropping to one knee and raising his weapon. "Open fire! Go!" Arthur yelled, breaking into a dead sprint toward the Kodiak's open ramp. The hangar erupted. The deafening roar of the kinetic repeaters tore through the hangar bay. Heavy, armor-piercing slugs ripped into the tarmac, sending chunks of concrete and sparks flying into the air. Arthur didn't look back. He kept his head down, his boots pounding against the deck. He heard the heavy rhythmic thud of the beast beside him, felt the sheer kinetic displacement of air as the massive predator ran interference, keeping its heavily armored shoulder angled between Arthur and the line of fire. A slug sparked off the beast's rear flank. The creature let out a short, violent hiss, but it didn't break stride. They hit the Kodiak's metal ramp together. The incline was steep, scored with deep traction grooves. Arthur scrambled up, his breath burning in his lungs, and dove into the dark, oil-stained cavern of the cargo hold. He hit the heavy grating hard, scraping his elbows, but immediately scrambled to his feet. "Hold the ramp!" Arthur screamed over his shoulder. He didn't need to give the order. The beast had already spun around. It planted its massive front paws on the edge of the descending metal incline, its body acting as a living, impenetrable barricade against the hangar bay. It let out a roar that shook the dust from the freighter's ceiling, a terrifying wall of sound that caused the advancing security guards to falter and pull back into cover. Arthur turned and sprinted through the dark, echoing hold. He slammed through the heavy bulkhead door leading to the crew corridor, his boots slipping on the grated flooring. He knew the layout of the Kodiak. He had repaired dozens of them. They were cheap, reliable, and possessed an ignition system that hadn't been updated in 40 years. He threw himself into the cockpit. It was a cramped, claustrophobic space that smelled heavily of stale sweat and cheap stimcaf. The avionics panels were dark. The main viewport showed the frantic red flashing of the hangar's lockdown sirens. Arthur threw himself into the pilot's seat. He reached under the main console, ignoring the standard ignition sequence keypad. He didn't have the codes. He grabbed the lower maintenance panel and yanked. The heavy plastic refused to budge. "Come on," Arthur grunted, his fingers slipping on the smooth surface. He pulled the rusted wrench from his belt, wedged it into the seam of the panel, and twisted violently. The cheap retaining clips snapped. The panel clattered to the floor, revealing a chaotic, dust-choked nest of thick-colored wiring and heavy optical cables. Outside, the gunfire intensified. The sharp staccato rhythm of the kinetic repeaters was joined by the high-pitched shriek of heavy plasma fire. Someone had rolled up a tripod-mounted cannon. "They bring fire, mechanic." The beast's voice echoed in Arthur's mind. It was tight, strained. The connection flickered with a sudden, sharp spike of pain that made Arthur flinch. "Hold on!" Arthur yelled, though he knew the beast was listening to his thoughts. "Just give me 30 seconds. Arthur plunged his bare hands into the wiring. The insulation was slick with age-old lubricant and grime. He didn't have a diagnostic pad. He had to do this entirely by touch and memory. He found the thick, braided main power conduit leading to the fuel injection manifold. He drew a small, folding utility knife from his pocket with his teeth, snapped it open, and began clumsily stripping the thick rubber insulation from the wires. His hands were shaking so badly he sliced the pad of his left thumb. He didn't feel it. He just saw the dark smear of blood mix with the grease on the copper filaments. He found the ignition relay, a thin yellow optical wire. He needed to cross the circuit, completely bypassing the ship's internal security handshake. He grabbed the exposed copper of the power conduit and forced it against the exposed core of the optical wire. A shower of blue sparks erupted from the console, raining down onto Arthur's lap. The sharp smell of ozone and melting plastic filled the small cockpit. Thrum. Deep in the bowels of the Kodiak, the massive sublight engines woke up. The deck plates vibrated. The avionics panels in front of Arthur flared to life, a cascade of green text scrolling across the dirty glass screens. "Yes," Arthur hissed, dropping the wires and grabbing the primary flight yoke. He slapped the ramp retraction lever. A heavy hydraulic groan echoed from the rear of the ship. "The ramp is lifting." The beast's voice was a heavy, exhausted rumble. "I am inside." "Good," Arthur shouted. He grabbed the thrust throttle and slammed it forward. The engines roared, a deafening crescendo of caged promethium exploding in the combustion chambers. But the ship didn't move. A sickening metallic shudder tore through the hull, throwing Arthur forward against the restraints. Warning klaxons blared inside the cockpit. A flashing red icon dominated the main screen. Docking clamps engaged. "Damn it!" Arthur screamed. The station's automated lockdown had engaged the heavy magnetic clamps on the landing pad. They were anchored to the floor. Outside the cockpit window, Arthur saw a squad of heavy armor security personnel pushing a massive, wheeled plasma cannon into position, aiming directly at the Kodiak's cockpit. He had no time to hack the release codes. He had to break them. Arthur reached over to the auxiliary control board. He found the manual thruster overrides. The Kodiak was designed to carry 10,000 tons of heavy ore. Its vertical lifters were obscenely overpowered. "Brace yourself!" Arthur screamed into the empty cockpit, his thought projecting loudly through the telepathic link. He grabbed both the primary throttle and the vertical lifter override. He didn't ease them forward. He violently shoved both levers past the safety red lines, pinning them flat against the console. The ship screamed. The structural integrity of the Kodiak was pushed instantly to its absolute breaking point. The sound of the engines went from a roar to a high-pitched, agonizing shriek of tearing metal and overpressurized fuel lines. The magnetic clamps held for 3 agonizing seconds. The ship vibrated so violently, Arthur's vision blurred. The console glass cracked. Then physics won. With a deafening, explosive crack that sounded like a tectonic plate snapping, the heavy Durasteel landing clamps tore clean out of the concrete pad. The Kodiak shot upward, completely uncontrolled. Arthur was slammed back into his seat by the sheer G-force. His breath was forced completely out of his lungs. He couldn't move his arms. The ship hurtled toward the heavy, reinforced ceiling of the hangar bay. The plasma cannon outside fired, but the Kodiak was already moving too fast. The superheated blue bolt scorched the underside of the hull, vaporizing a layer of armor plating, but missing the vital engine pods. "Hold together!" Arthur wheezed through clenched teeth, fighting the overwhelming pressure on his chest. He blindly slammed his palm against the directional thruster controls, banking the massive, unwieldy freighter toward the atmospheric shield separating Hangar 4 from the vacuum of space. The ship didn't fly gracefully. It handled like a falling building. It scraped violently against the upper fueling gantries, shearing off massive chunks of metal, piping that rained down onto the security forces below. The atmospheric shield, a shimmering, translucent barrier of energy, was rapidly closing as the station's lockdown protocols attempted to seal the bay. "We're not going to make it," Arthur thought, his eyes wide as the gap of black space narrowed to a sliver. "Push through, mechanic." The beast's voice was a solid, anchoring weight in the chaos of Arthur's mind. "Break the paper!" Arthur roared, wrapping both hands around the yoke and pulling back with everything he had. The nose of the Kodiak slammed into the closing edge of the heavy blast doors just as it hit the atmospheric shield. The impact threw Arthur violently against his restraints, his head snapping forward. The ship groaned, the structural supports buckling under the immense pressure. For a terrifying second, they were wedged. Then, the massive sublight engines, still screaming past their red lines, delivered their final, brute force payload of kinetic energy. The ship ripped through the failing shield. The sudden transition from atmospheric pressure to hard vacuum was violently abrupt. The sound of the screaming engines and the tearing metal was instantly silenced, replaced by a deep, profound quiet. The Kodiak tumbled out into the cold, infinite black. Arthur's hands remained white-knuckled around the yoke long after the station had shrunk to a blinking, insignificant cluster of lights against the backdrop of deep space. The silence inside the cockpit was heavy, broken only by the erratic, cycling hum of the overtaxed life support systems and the rapid, raspy sound of his own breathing. He slowly unclenched his fingers. They were completely numb, locked into the shape of the controls. He slumped back into the worn padding of the pilot's seat. He stared out the cracked viewport at the sprawling, indifferent expanse of stars. There were no sirens. There was no laughter. There was only the quiet, crushing peace of the void. He had done it. He had actually stolen a ship and broken a station blockade. A sudden, sharp spike of phantom pain radiated from the base of his skull, pulling him instantly back to reality. Cold, the deep voice murmured in his mind. It lacked its usual thunder. It sounded frayed, exhausted. Arthur unbuckled his restraints with trembling, blood-smeared hands. He pushed himself out of the pilot's seat. His legs felt like they were made of water, and he had to lean heavily against the bulkhead to keep from collapsing. "I'm coming," Arthur croaked, his voice raw. He stumbled out of the cockpit, navigating the narrow, dimly lit crew corridor. He hit the manual release for the heavy blast door leading to the cargo hold. The door slid open, revealing the massive, cavernous space. The artificial gravity in the hold was malfunctioning, operating at perhaps 60% of standard. The air was thick with the smell of scorched fur, ionized ozone, and the coppery stench of heavy alien blood. The beast was lying on its side near the center of the grated deck. It looked smaller somehow, curled tightly inward. Its heavy, armored breathing was shallow and ragged. As Arthur approached, his boots clicking softly on the metal, he saw the extent of the damage. The plasma bolt that had struck the ship during their ascent hadn't completely missed. A glancing shock wave of superheated energy had penetrated the lower hull integrity, flashing through the hold. A massive charred gouge ran along the beast's rear flank, exposing the thick, dense musculature beneath the bone plates. The heavy black fur was singed away, and dark, viscous blood was pooling slowly on the grating beneath the creature. Arthur dropped to his knees beside the predator. The heat radiating from the wound was intense, like an open oven. The beast didn't lift its head. Its blind sensory pits pulsed with a weak, erratic amber light. "The sky is quiet here, little brother," the beast communicated. The telepathic weight was gentle, almost soothing, despite the obvious agony the creature was in. "It is a good place for the heavy-born to rest." "You're not resting," Arthur snapped, his voice cracking with a sudden, fierce panic. "You don't get to die now. We just got out." He scrambled up, his eyes scanning the cluttered walls of the cargo hold. He spotted a heavy industrial emergency locker bolted to the far bulkhead. He ran to it, ripping the heavy red handle down. The locker spilled open, revealing heavy-duty hazard suits, rebreathers, and a massive Durasteel first aid kit designed for catastrophic industrial accidents. He grabbed the med kit and a heavy portable plasma welding torch used for hull patching. He ran back and slid onto his knees beside the beast. He popped the latches on the med kit. It was filled with heavy coagulant foams, synthetic skin grafts, and broad-spectrum alien antibiotics. But the wound was too wide, the bleeding too heavy. "I have to stop the bleeding," Arthur said, his voice trembling. He looked at the heavy welding torch in his hand. "This is going to hurt. It's going to hurt worse than the collar." The beast let out a slow, rumbling exhale that rustled Arthur's dirty jumpsuit. I am the apex, the voice resonated, finding a fraction of its former iron. Pain is the weather of my world. Do what you must, mechanic. Arthur ignited the welding torch. A short, viciously bright blue flame hissed into existence. He didn't hesitate. If he gave himself time to think, he would lose his nerve. He pressed the searing flame directly against the exposed, bleeding edge of the plasma burn. The smell was instantaneous and horrific, the heavy, suffocating stench of burning fat and cooking meat. The beast's entire body went rigid, the massive tree trunk limbs locked straight out. A sound escaped its jaws, a high, vibrating hiss of pure, concentrated agony that shook the deck plates. But it didn't pull away. It didn't strike out. It lay perfectly still, trusting the fragile, shaking Terran kneeling beside it. Arthur worked fast, dragging the torch along the worst of the arterial tears, searing the flesh shut. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, mixing with the grease and dirt. He gagged, his stomach heaving from the smell, but his hands remained steady. He understood fixing things. He understood sealing a breach. After what felt like an eternity, he killed the torch. He threw it aside, the metal clattering loudly across the hold. He grabbed the heavy cans of industrial biofoam from the med kit and sprayed the thick, cooling white substance entirely over the charred, sealed wound. Arthur collapsed backward onto the metal grating, completely spent. He stared up at the rusted, exposed pipes running along the ceiling of the cargo hold. His chest heaved as he dragged in lungfuls of the sterile, recycled air. Slowly, the tension bled out of the beast's massive frame. Its breathing slowed, deepening into a heavy, rhythmic cadence. Arthur felt a sudden, gentle weight against his side. He turned his head. The beast had shifted, dragging its massive, bone-plated skull across the deck until its snout was resting against Arthur's hip. The sensory pits were glowing a calm, steady red again. Arthur didn't pull away. He reached out with a trembling, blood-stained hand and rested it on the heavy, scarred armor plating of the creature's forehead. The bone was warm, vibrating faintly with the deep, resonant purr of the apex predator. "The leak is sealed," the beast murmured in his mind, the telepathic projection laced with a profound, unshakable gratitude. "You are a master of broken things, little brother." "Yeah," Arthur whispered, a tired, genuine smile breaking through the grime on his face. He looked down at the massive alien monster, feeling a connection that defied species, biology, and the cold logic of the galaxy. "I guess I am." They lay there on the cold floor of the stolen freighter, bathed in the dim emergency lighting, surrounded by the infinite silence of deep space. They were miles away from the rust and the roar, two survivors forged in the heavy dirt, finally charting their own course. Arthur closed his eyes, his hand resting on the beast. "Get some sleep, big guy," Arthur said softly. "Tomorrow we're going to go find Earth. That's where we leave Arthur and his apex brother. Drifting in the cold vacuum, two heavy world survivors who finally broke their chains. If this gritty tale of blood, ozone, and defying the cosmic odds hit you right in the chest, smash that like button. It proves to the algorithm that humanity isn't soft, helping push these stories to other sci-fi fans who crave real, raw HFY. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next upload. Drop a comment below and share which death world you would choose to survive. See you in the dark.